Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
When to compromise and when to hold fast to our principles is one of the most difficult challenges we face when dealing with conflict. Today we will consider how these two values simultaneously prevent us and enable us to deal with some of the most difficult conflicts in our life. Hello, I'm your guest host, Stephen Kotev, and joining us today for our program entitled The Riddle of Principle and Compromise, How We Can't Have One Without the Other, is mediator, professor, and author Bernie Mayer. Bernie is a professor of dispute resolution for the Werner Institute at Creighton University. For over 30 years, he has been a leader in the conflict resolution field. Bernie has facilitated many complex environmental conflicts, commercial and organizational disputes, interpersonal conflicts, public decision-making processes, and has an extensive background in family mediation as well. He is a founding partner of CDR Associates, a pioneering conflict intervention firm located in Boulder, Colorado. Bernie is the author of many books and articles, including The Dynamics of Conflict, A Guide to Engagement and Intervention, Beyond Neutrality, Confronting the Crisis in Conflict Resolution, and Staying with Conflict, a strategic approach to ongoing disputes. He's currently working on a new book, The Conflict Paradox, which is due to be published in early 2015. Bernie lives in Kingsville, Ontario, and Boulder, Colorado. Welcome to the show, Bernie.
Thank you, Stephen. It's good to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, I've known you for a while, so it's a pleasure to have you on the show. And for folks who don't know you, tell us a little bit about why you chose to do this type of work.
Well, sometimes I think the work chose to do me instead of me choosing to do the work, in a sense. I was working as a therapist and a child and family therapist and a program director. I had done some work with people who had substance abuse problems, and I was working with kids in residential treatment of one kind or another in Colorado. And there was a nuclear weapons plant nearby called Rocky Flats, but there were all sorts of political actions that I'd been involved in around. And somebody asked me to attend a training in nonviolent social change. I thought, well, that sounds interesting, and I went there, and the person giving the training was somebody named Christopher Moore, who's the author of The Mediation Process, and we immediately became very close friends, and I started doing training in nonviolence and in dealing with conflict in political situations, and I did some in prisons, and it just felt natural to me. I didn't think of it as a work, just as something that was interesting to do, but then suddenly the opportunity to get involved in an organization that was sort of had no money and was running out of funds, but was then called the Center for Dispute Resolution came up, and Chris and I, a couple of other people, Mary Margaret Golton and Susan Wildow, embraced it, and it just took off, and suddenly I found myself working in this field.
Well, and I feel pretty lucky to have you on the show because you've done so many different things, and with that comes some really valuable insight. And there's things that sometimes folks haven't really thought about, or it's something they experience, but it isn't something they can put their finger on it. And I was so happy that you chose this topic for today's program because principle and compromise are so essential to so many folks' decisions and also, in a sense, their problems. And, I thought maybe I'd ask you to sort of start off and give us your definition of the terms and then your general thoughts about how they relate to each other.
Okay, well, let me just sort of set the context by asking you and your listeners to think about how many times have you heard somebody say, I can't compromise because it's a matter of principle. And I think that is something that people often fall back on because, number one, they're avoiding an issue, and number two, because they really don't understand how you can do something on something you care deeply about, like what's in the best interest of your child, without being immoral. So that's why I think it's a really important topic. So in terms of definition, people use the term principle in many different ways. For our purposes, let's think about it in terms of our values, our beliefs about right or wrong, our norms about behavior. And I think what we're dealing with in conflict, there are two types. We're dealing about principles about the substance itself. In other words, I absolutely believe it is not all right for me to have to compromise in any way about the matter of sexual harassment in the workplace, let's say. It's not okay. It's got to be absolutely stood up to. But there's also principles we have about process, such as we have as a principle everybody ought to have a ability to articulate their point of view in a mediation or their concerns. They ought not to be shut down. In terms of what we mean by compromise is the ways in which we actually feel we have to give up something that we care about that's important to us, either on the process or the substance of an issue, in order to get something else we maybe even care about more or to get any agreement at all. And so I think those are the ways that, for our purposes, we can understand the terms.
And I think it's really, really interesting how they feed together. And I wanted to then have you start walking us down this path or labyrinth that is the paradox between the two, between principle and compromise, and in a sense how they're related to each other, how they depend on each other, but also how they confound us.
So let me give you a third definition, then, at least as I use it, and that is the term paradox, because the book that I just completed a draft of, the conflict paradox, looks at a number of these, and this is one of them. And the way I understand paradox is that they are two truths that we believe to be true anyhow that seem to be in contradiction to each other. And yet the paradox is that they are both true. And so in this case, the paradox is that we people believe you have to either stand on your principle or compromise. And they see these as a choice. They see these, and the truth is you have to compromise in conflict, and the truth also is that it's important not to compromise principles. And yet, the reason it's ultimately a paradox is that there's an ultimate truth, an ultimate unity here. And so let me try to tell you what it is by reading you a quote from a discussion of Abraham Lincoln by Stephen Smith, and that is this: principle without compromise is empty. Compromise without principle is blind. And the reason I like that quote is because I think it gets at the fact that you can't have one without the other. You can stand on empty principle and not in any way further that principle whatsoever. Or you can compromise all you want, but if it's not somehow based on principle and you're doing it with a sense of principle, then the compromise becomes weak, and you'll find that you will not ultimately accomplish what you're trying to accomplish by the compromise itself. So that's what I mean. That's the kind of situation I'm talking about. And I think in conflict, all of us, forget whether we're intervening in it a moment, just imagine ourselves in conflict, feel that all the time. Do I compromise on something or do I stand on principle? And what I'm trying to get people to understand, what I'm trying to work with myself on understanding also, is that, it's not a choice. You have to do both. You can't give up your principles. On the other hand, you can't accomplish them without compromise either.
Right. This program is primarily dedicated towards the general public. I think folks from practitioners of conflict resolution, are going to pay attention to what you have to say, in addition to, us wanting to have folks who don't know about you get a chance to hear what you have to say. And I'm really glad that you're sharing this with us today, because this to me is one of those essential things that folks either consciously or subconsciously deal with on a regular basis. I think of those, it's those circumstances where you've got a parent and you're trying to make a decision for what do you do with the child. And there's this thing of, okay, here's the consequence. And then there's sort of like, okay, well, what's the context that goes with it? And I really like your quote in showing how you can have folks who are super rigid, but in a sense don't get what they really are trying to accomplish. And I think that's a really fascinating observation.
Well, I think it's sort of basic to what we all deal with whenever we're in a conflict. Whether it's about our kids, whether it's about in a workplace between, let's say, partners at work, in which there's a feeling that they're not each carrying their load of work, that people end up feeling that they are acting on principle, and suddenly when people act on principle, they get rigid, and yet that's really not how we best promote our principles.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting.
Let me give you one other arena to think about this.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a lot of work with environmental conflict, and so just think about environmentalists and developers trying to sit down and talk about putting in a oil pipeline, let's say the Keystone XL pipeline that's been in the news a lot. The fact is, if they each are thinking this is all about principle, then there's nowhere to go. And in fact, they won't further their principles. On the other hand, if they could compromise for the sake of getting agreement, that's not okay either.
Well, and you're touching on a couple of things. The one that I relate to is that, a lot of the teaching and training that I do, I talk about what's happening inside folks' physiology, what's happening in their bodies. And if you have this very kind of stiff way where you're almost completely tight, you really can't move. And then the other end of it is if you're almost so relaxed to the point of being limp, you also can't move. And so it's finding that proper alignment, that proper amount of tension between, to me, the metaphor of principle and the metaphor of compromise. That's the first part. But I really think it's important for us to consider how, when we're talking about compromise, I don't think it's in a sense this compromise that is the equivalent of collapse. When you're talking about how these Keystone folks can work together, it's that thing of either taking either side is going to basically not get them there where they want to go. And so they've got to find a way of going in between the two of them. That's kind of what I'm hearing you say, and I want to check in to see if I've got that right.
Well, yeah, right. However, it's not. It may very well be that from an environmentalist point of view, this pipeline just shouldn't happen. But that doesn't solve the energy problems of our country, just to say no. And I think more environmentalists understand that, the more they realize there's some choices that have to be made. And if you're somebody who is very much pro-development of it, just sort of bullying your way through and it has to happen because of, that too isn't sustainable unless you really fundamentally know that you have to work with the people who are, or with the forces who are very concerned about what's happening with global climate change. And so I think the most sustainable way here isn't necessarily that they have to compromise on this particular project. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But underneath it all, they have to understand that there are key principles, but those principles don't mean that you don't have some choices to make, or you'll just become irrelevant.
Right. So I want to remind folks that you're listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk Radio program with your guest host, myself, Stephen Kotev. Today I'm joined by Bernie Mayer, and we're discussing the riddle of principle and compromise, how we can't have one without the other. And I think, Bernie, what you were just saying is to me also so important. If we're so attached to compromise, if we're so attached to principle, you just mentioned it. It was that thing of not getting us where we wanted to go. And that's one of those things that I really wanted us to focus more on, if possible, in our conversation today is how do these things tie into our everyday life? And what can we do to better manage this paradox?
So, first of all, I think every day in our life we have to make compromises that sometimes just don't feel very, very good. We have to do it to make our marriages work. We have to do it in our workplace. We have to do it with our kids, who are usually excellent negotiators at tying us in knots around the principles that we espouse. And we do it with our neighbors. We do it every place. And so I think it's one of life's fundamental challenges is how to be both principled and flexible. How to understand that principles are pragmatic. How to understand that being principled is not the same as being rigid. And it's a challenge that a employer faces in having very clear expectations at the workplace, but also figuring out how to face the fact that those expectations can't always be rigidly applied. Even in seemingly very hierarchical workplaces, like the military, where there are clear directions and there are clear principles people have to follow, people also have to be flexible with it, or it doesn't work. And I think this is just something that I think you could just ask yourself today, is there something that I believe in that I've actually had to compromise on today? And you'll be able to find something because it's everywhere.
Right. And it's interesting, as I was thinking about and preparing for this show, how it almost reminds me of the sort of the classic yin and yang, that sort of symbol where if we need the principle to guide us, and that also can be the thing that brings us down. Because one of your first questions was, how many times have you been in circumstances where folks are saying, I'm not giving in, because this is based off of the principle. And what was interesting, in thinking about this further is that what I believe you do in those circumstances is have folks dig a little bit deeper into what's behind that principle and having them understand it better as a way of kind of moving forward as opposed to getting stuck. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate. You don't make progress on either of these things, on any of these things, by not articulating them. One of the most valuable things we can do when we are dealing with this struggle is to articulate the principle. What is the principle here? I say this to people all the time. There's a principle here. It's important. What is it? Well, I don't think, it's right that I should be only able to see my kid on weekends and 1 or 2 evenings a week. Fathers are just as important as mothers, and they should be treated that way. Okay, what's the principle here? You tell me. That was somebody saying saying something that was on the surface sounds like a principle, but dig deeper. So focus on why fathers are just as important as mothers in the upbringing of kids. All right, tell me more about that. Let's really get into understanding why that's important to you, what's important about it. I could look at it from another person's point of view as well. As, for example, somebody might say, it's really important that a kid have a stable home, that they're not going back and forth all the time, and that seems critical. All right, talk to me about that. What's the principle here? And the more you get people to articulate the principle, then I think what you say, you ought not to give in, you ought not to compromise on what you think is fundamental here. But you also ought to understand that not every decision, not every deviation from exactly equal time, for example, is compromising the principle. Or if you stick to that, then the underlying principle which may be I want my role as a father to be as powerful and as influential as the role of a mother. You might actually not be able to accomplish that because you suddenly now are in this rigid kind of thing where it's all about exact time, and it's not really all about making sure you each have a powerful role.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I also love about...
the one other thing I would say, it's very helpful when talking about principles to encourage people to talk about what they believe in, not what they believe against. Because a lot of times, instead of saying what are our principles, people say, well, I don't believe in that. Well, that actually is a road to conflict, not a road to understanding.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's really fascinating about getting folks to sort of talk a bit more about their principles is that I think it then becomes pretty apparent what are the assumptions that accompany it. Because if you have this sort of like, well, okay, I have to go and make sure that as a father I'm going to go and be represented, well, it's like, well, what else is behind that? Why do you have to hold on to that principle? Is it the expectation that, X, Y, or Z other thing is going to happen, and if I compromise, then that's definitely going to go forth? And, it sounds like they could be right in their assumption, but at least it gets it out there and gives folks something to talk about versus, it's either my way or the highway.
Well, I think you're touching on something else that's an important part of it. When people get very rigid about their principles, oftentimes it's because they don't feel very empowered. And the reliance on a principle, the reliance on a rigid adherence to principle, rather than understanding principles as a guide to action, is because people often feel if they give a little bit, then they suddenly won't have any way of defending themselves. It's like you let the nose of the camel into the tent once you compromise at all. And so I think it's important to understand the way in which we use principle that is for reasons other than actually adhering to or furthering that principle. It is often about power. It's often about feeling vulnerable. It's often about feeling people can't quite articulate things very well. So instead of really thinking about it, they just rigidly say it has to be this way. And I think one of the ways in which we can help ourselves as well as others is to ask ourselves when we find ourselves in the role of saying this principle is important to me, therefore I can't possibly compromise on it. It is important to say, why is it so hard for me to do it? What am I afraid of? What am I worried about here? And that may be a very legitimate worry. It may be the moment you indicate any flexibility, somebody else is going to try to rush through that door. But but once you know it, then you realize you're not quite talking about principle. You're talking about something else.
Well, and that was also interesting what you were saying before about how you want them to say what it is that they have a principle for, not what they have a principle against. And, what I've seen from your prior work is that if you get folks to establish what they have principles for, then you may be able to find some common ground. There may be something that folks mutually care about. And, not 100% in alignment, we both want the exact same thing, but there may be enough there that it turns the corner from this being the I don't like you and you're terrible to, oh yeah, you maybe actually have something there, or yeah, I agree with that too. Is that also part of the process that you see for folks in dealing with this in everyday life?
Well, sure. I mean, there's no question that's part of what helps people. That's part of what helps people do that. I guess I want to emphasize, I'm not actually asking people in any way to sacrifice the principles. I think we all have to have principles that we live by and act on and that are important to us. But we have to understand that you don't actualize those principles best through complete rigidity. Even if you win in a particular case, in the long run you sow the seeds for more challenges later on.
Mm-hmm. Is there one either phrase or example that really exemplifies that last point you emphasized with us?
Well, it strikes me that you can look at any big policy issue we're dealing with right now, And you can realize that in achieving it, well, here, let me give you an example from not such long ago world history. Think about what happened at the end of apartheid, when Nelson Mandela was in jail and he was negotiating with de Klerk, and one of the things that he agreed to, and he took a lot of heat for it, was that they would not prosecute people for crimes of political crimes under apartheid if people were willing to go in front of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and talk and admit to what they happened and show some understanding and ownership of it. Well, that's actually why they started the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was because they'd already made that agreement. Now, this was a very big compromise on his part, on Mandela's part, because there were a lot of his followers felt that he ought to be insisting that there be some people held to account for the horrible crimes they had committed. He said, I understand that. We have to think of accountability in a new way. We have to move forward. The most important thing we're trying to do is end this apartheid, end this white minority rule, create a genuine democracy here, and therefore we're going to have to give up some of these things which we hold very dear. And he had the moral authority to do it because he'd been in prison for 25 years because of it. Now, people still today wonder if that was an appropriate move. You go to South Africa, and it's still somewhat controversial based on all what's happened there. But that's an interesting example, and you can look at every public policy issue there is, and it's the same thing. And I guess if I were to say a phrase to stick in mind, is this: principles are pragmatic, compromises would help us reach our principle, enact our principles.
Mm-hmm. Well, it also, in a sense, it's kind of like, what path do you take up the mountain? If there's a destination, what's the way you're going to get there? And as I was reading, listening through what everything is that you're saying and kind of reading into it, is that it also, I think, ties back into the context. You got to read the context, because sometimes the course that you're on maybe isn't the best course of action.
Well, always. We always have to go forward on any big issue anyhow. I mean, I just don't think we ever get to. Yeah, it's interesting you use a mountain analogy. As a longtime resident of Colorado, there's many times I've gone to climb mountains, and you have to be aware of what we call summit fever, which is you think the only important thing is getting to the top. And there are a number of times where if you don't turn back, you're risking your life, because weather's moving in, or lightning, or fatigue, or dehydration, and you want to read a great book about that, read Into Thin Air about Mount Everest. And so, to me, the metaphor there is that if you think it's only about reaching the top of the mountain, then you really sacrificed you ignored a very healthy part of what it's all about. It really is about a journey that in a process that you go to. And if the top of the mountain is the most purely stated form of the principle, the actualization of the principle is all about the journey.
Huh. So, talk to me a little bit, just briefly, about how this paradox ties into your upcoming book, The Conflict Paradox, because it sounds like you've got other paradoxes that you're also sort of thinking about or talking about. Just clue us in briefly as to what some of those are.
All right. So I believe that one of the ways in which we can really understand what happens in conflict, and one of the ways people go through changes in conflict, is by looking at things that we believe to be in opposition to each other. We believe in polarities or opposites. And in fact, there's a unity there. And what we have to begin to understand is, what is that unity? And that's how we move forward through conflict. That's how we understand conflict differently, on both a very personal level and a very social level. So in this book, I talk about 7 paradoxes, which to me collectively define the challenge more than almost anything else. But they're the ones that speak very much to me, and they include things like compromise and principle, which we've talked about here, but also competition and cooperation, avoidance and engagement, logic and emotions, community and autonomy, neutrality and advocacy, and each of those things, and I'm sure I've left out some because I'm just doing these off the top of my head here, but each of these things you can understand as things that we, optimism and realism is another one. Each of these things are things in which we think, God, you got to have a choice here. And even if we don't think it, we feel it, we act that way. And with each of them, when you dig deeper, when you understand exactly what it requires to be genuinely effective in cooperation, for example, you'll realize part of that is you have to be able to compete when you need to. And cooperation without competition isn't very real. And competition without some sort of cooperation doesn't work very well either, unless you've got a lot more power than the other person or the other party. So to me, that it's almost a methodology for how we understand and how we move through conflict. Is we understand where people are assuming that there is a opposition here and act that way, and they're locked into that. But if you dig deeper, it isn't. There's an underlying unity here. And, of course, that's basic to what we have to understand in conflict itself about the substance, because we tend to believe we have the truth and the other side's wrong, and they think the same thing about us. And the most important thing that really happens over the course of conflict is we come to realize, well, maybe there really is truth on both sides. But we don't do that simply by saying that. We do that through the vehicle of all these other contradictions that get in our way and that we have to delve into and delve more deeply into. And, I'm describing this in very conceptual terms, but we naturally do this every day of our lives. We naturally make these principle and compromise decisions all the time. We naturally work between cooperation and competition all the time. We think that maybe we're just being illogical, but if we don't have access to our emotions, our logic doesn't work. Decision-making requires an emotional involvement, or you can't make decisions. And that's something that I'm not just making up. There's some real good research from neuroscience that absolutely shows that to be the case. So I think that this is almost an approach, fundamental approach to what we actually really have to do in conflict to get to where we can get beyond thinking it's all about us being right and the other side being wrong.
So as we start to wrap up the show, to have folks who would want to engage with this content and this topic further, what kind of assignment for the week would you give them?
Well, I would say review at some point during each day what principles have been in operation for you today about anything. I just finished mowing my lawn. I think there are principles about mowing my lawn, like, when it's all right to do it and when it isn't, for example, and when it's all right for my neighbor to do it and it isn't. About your kids, about your work, about driving. Driving is a great opportunity to think about that. And what are the principles in operation here? And what have you had kind of compromises have you had to make in order to move forward so that you're fundamentally adhering to the principle, but not able to do it perfectly?
And when you're talking about driving, it's sort of like, do I let this person in? Do I try to get past this person? Those kind of things are part of that whole principle internal dialogue. Is that what you mean?
Well, yeah, sure. So I ride a bike. So my view of what the right principles are about sharing the road when I'm riding a bike is very different than when I'm driving my car and there's somebody else riding the bike.
Yeah, that's a beautiful example.
I was with my daughter yesterday, and she was seeing some guy who was biking. He said, well, they should get more over to my side. And I said, well, Hopi, they tell you that you're supposed to occupy a third of the road to be safe when you're biking. She said, really? I said, yeah. So as a principal, do I always occupy a third of the road? If I always followed that principle, I would be dead by now. So that's
But no, I think it's exactly the kind of example that I think will help folks. So if folks, were loved today, wanted to know more about you, how can folks reach you? How can folks contact you?
Well, two things. One is I'm happy to get emails from anybody who's interested, and the easiest way to email me is through my Creighton University email, which is Bernie Mayer, BernieMayer, at Creighton.edu. That's CEREIGHTON.edu. And there's another place for people to go to is the ADR Hub website, which often has information about what's going on, and it has a lot of links to stuff I've done. But
and what's the URL? Is that adrhub.com or
it's adrhub.com, right? This book should be out in early 2015, The Conflict Paradox. It's the first book that's going to ever be jointly published by Josie Bass, which is a division of John Wiley, and the American Bar Association. So I encourage people to keep their eyes open for that.
Well, and Bernie, you realize you've given me something so tempting I can't pass up. I hope you had fun today and that you'd come back again to talk to us a bit more about this book on a future episode.
Of course, I did have fun today, and I would be happy to do that. I hope you had fun too, Stephen.
I did. Any closing comments for folks? Any last words or things that you want to leave folks with before we close up?
Well, what I hope, and I know sometimes it's hard to make this jump, is that people don't see this as an abstract thing. I think this is a very practical challenge we have in our everyday life, in our practical capacity to be able to see beyond things that we tend to view as choices, and to see the necessity of holding both as a unified truth, is a very practical demand that is very close to what makes us successful in all different realms of the work we do in our lives.
Well, Bernie, thank you so much for being on the show. It was a true pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very glad I could do it.
Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.